If you enjoy listening to adventure stories, then you should visit thedihedral.com. You will find stories from other members of the community and read about climbing, life, and the outdoors. Follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. Let's connect and climb on!
Climb on! Roll! Hi everyone, this is Clara, welcoming you to another episode of the Dihedral Podcast. Today we are joined by one of the great historians of our time. Dr. Jennifer Ratner-Rosenhagen is a distinguished professor of history at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She has several papers and books to her name, including her 2021 book, American Intellectual History, from A Very Short Introduction series, her 2019 release of the acclaimed The Ideas That Made America, A Brief History, and the topic of today's discussion, the award-winning 2012 book, American Nietzsche, A History of an Icon and His Ideas. There's a lot. Let me just say for the readers who, you should definitely read this book, but there's a lot of really, really interesting personalities that come out in this book but there's two that I want to talk about in the time that we have. One is a guy by the name of Wilbur Urban, who Jennifer actually opens the book with. And then another is a person by the name of Emma Goldman, who kind of makes an appearance somewhere in the middle of the book. But Jennifer, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about these people, neither of which I have ever heard of until reading your book. And I'm sure most people haven't heard of them unless they're like deeply steeped in this conversation. But they're both really interesting and I think important. So if there's any words that you can say about them, I'd love to hear it.
So, Carrot, it's unsurprising that you've never heard of Wilbur Urban because he didn't, he was important in his own day, but he isn't someone who's gone on to be long remembered in history. In fact, I had never encountered him before. I was doing this research, and frankly, I haven't come across him again since. But he's fascinating because he's so emblematic of a particular type of encounter. So I start the book with Wilbur Urban as an example of someone who, reads Nietzsche and, his life changes in a matter of 12 hours.
Yeah.
So Urban was in the late 19th century, was getting his PhD in philosophy here in the United States. But in those days, if you really wanted to be credentialed as an academic philosopher, you went to Germany. And so Urban did what, any dutiful philosopher, American philosopher would do at that time, went to Germany. And he tells the story that, he's at the university doing what he's supposed to do, but then he stumbles across a book of Nietzsche's in a bookstore and opens it up and is sort of intrigued by it and takes it home. And he ends up reading the book through the night. And as he describes it, it's like he went to the darkness closed in with one moral universe. And as he, read and the sun came up the next day, he had entered a new moral universe, that Nietzsche had just so upended everything he thought, not just about philosophy, but about morality, about truth, about himself. And then Urban goes on to be a professional philosopher in the United States, and Nietzsche continues to be an important influence on him. Nietzsche doesn't make his way into professional academic American philosophy until much later, but Urban is one of those early thinkers who is really, sort of a seismic, if you will, transformation. Maybe that's not even enough, his whole worldview shifts up. And what I love about that story, Carrot, is just I came across it again and again and again and again. Someone stumbling across Nietzsche, wondering who this guy was with a funny name, or maybe they had heard something about him. They open it up, and it doesn't take much of Nietzsche's prose for a reader to really be either appalled and want to close it up. Right, that happens too. But the other version, and this is I think maybe more common version, is to be absolutely inducted into the prose, the ideas, the argument. And I have so many, I'll just digress for a moment. Although Jack London was a Nietzsche fan,
Yeah.
referred to Nietzsche as his Bible. If
awesome.
if any of your audience are Jack London fans, it's really not hard to go back now and read a little Nietzsche, and then see how London is trying to work through Nietzsche's ideas in his novels. But the other Jack I meant to mention in this context of the like life transformed was Jack Kerouac,
Right.
who in, I believe it's the mid or early 1940s, borrows Allen Ginsberg, the poet Allen Ginsberg,
That's
New
so
York
cool.
Public Library card, and goes in and checks out Nietzsche's Birth of Tragedy. And Jack Kerouac, this is before Jack Kerouac is, on the road, as it were, reads Nietzsche, is absolutely intoxicated, and he ends up cutting himself and writing a Nietzsche quote in his blood.
Oh my God, yeah.
And it's about like the higher purpose of art. Yeah. And he later says, this sort of helped put him on his road, no pun intended, to himself.
Yeah.
So I just love that Urban. So again, I'm sure Urban himself as a full human being was super fascinating.
Yeah.
For me, for the relevance of this story, it's that what he goes through, we're already at the beginning of the Nietzsche reception, is repeated time and time and time and time again over the following, 100+ years, which is that the discovery of Nietzsche, and then the absolute, revolution, if you will, breaking open, enlightenment, call it what you will, but a really radical transformation in someone's own sense of themselves and sense of the world just by that encounter with his philosophy.
It's one of those things where sorry to interrupt. I was just gonna say that for one, I thought it was just a brilliant opening hook of the book, because for people who are familiar with Nietzsche or read Nietzsche, what he wrote or what you wrote and brought some of his quotes in is very relatable to. And so you see people like Jack Kerouac and Jack London. And I think just even, somebody who's finding Nietzsche for the first time, we open and we're like, what is this?
Yeah,
this
is
so great. And so I could relate to a certain degree, and I think most people can. And so from the very first page, I'm like, oh, I got to see more of this. And you just kept providing more and more and more of these stories, and it was really quite brilliant. So I just wanted to say that before we moved on.
Well, I'm glad. I mean, to me, these were some of the stories, if you will, that most captured my imagination, and I felt like I've got to get this down. And it's partly because you're actually seeing people encounter new ideas, and have it change them. So and for me, that's pretty powerful stuff, right? As a historian, to see it doesn't have to be another kind of other kinds of experiences, a war, an election, an illness, falling in love, there's all sorts of things that we understand change people, but how is it that ideas change people? And so these records of these encounters are really quite, they're wonderful resources to see how people encounter new ideas that they could have never imagined or never thought were possible, and how those ideas can get, can work to help to change how they view themselves, how they view their world. And it doesn't mean they all become Nietzschean, so to speak, but it just means that there's a fundamental kind of rattling rupture and reorientation that happens. So, and that's why I'll just, if I may just put just signal one of the favorite parts of working on this was discovering the fan letters to the Nietzsche archive. So in the book, the middle, I have an interlude, and it's basically looking at the fan letters that were written by readers of Nietzsche to Nietzsche himself, although in almost every case he had already either gone mad or had died, so he never got these letters. Most of them though went to his sister Elizabeth Forster Nietzsche, who was his literary executor. And these are average people who, average readers, people who in every other way have been lost to history, Jenny Hintz of Yonkers, New York, or John Bush of Duluth, Minnesota. Not average people who read Nietzsche and are so moved by him that they want to write a letter either trying to reach out, can I get his autograph? Can I get a lock of his hair? Can you tell me, is he still alive? Let me tell you, Nietzsche saved me from suicide. I mean, these letters are extraordinary. So that's something I liked. It was important to me to feature in the book, because so that it's not just a story of like professional and intellectuals, you know, reading other professional intellectuals, but it's just like average Americans who have a yearning, who have a longing, and that Nietzsche, reading Nietzsche, you know, opens something up for them, or that the philosophy really moves them. So that's material in the book that's very near and dear to my heart.
You can see why too. When I went through the index before I even started reading it, it took everything I had not to just jump ahead to the interlude. And I was like, no, like pace yourself. It'll be there when you get there, and it's absolutely worth the wait. It's just awesome. It's great.
So yes, and now I'll just make one reference in there. One of the kinds of letters that I talk about a letter from a 12-year-old boy who writes and says, my mom loves your philosophy. I'm going to read it when I grow up. And he's asking for an autograph. And then there are letters from people who say, I have good news for you. I am the Übermensch. I am what your brother was envisioning. You know, because there's a lot of people, right, who unfortunately, many who read Nietzsche and think they were the Übermensch that he had in mind. I mean, this is the whole backstory with Leopold and Loeb, the two University of Chicago students in the mid-1920s who read Nietzsche and wanted to test their will to power, and ended up abducting and then killing a 14-year-old boy. I mean, there's a really horrible and grotesque part of this history as well. But the idea that readers read Nietzsche and think, wait, I'm the Superman, like that, or I'm that person. So I talk about some of those letters. But this is a nice pivot then, Carrot, to Emma Goldman, who you asked about. And she's someone who, if you haven't heard of her before, you'll be happy to have met her acquaintance. And I encourage you, or any of your listeners, you can Google, you know, her most of her major writings are just even available on the web. And so Emma Goldman is an example of someone who read Nietzsche and thought, oh, I'm the Uberfrau. I'm what he had in mind, but just in female form. And she might have been right. If ever there was an Uberfrau, she's awesome. So in brief, Emma Goldman was a Lithuanian-born, it was then part of the Russian Empire, emigre who comes to the United States in the late 19th century. And she's from a Jewish family, very conservative family. And she comes and she's just, you know, wants to break from the conventions, the sexism, the stifling world that she came from. And she comes here and she's like, oh, it's here, it's here as well. And she becomes very radicalized by a lot of the labor politics in America in the late 19th century. So this is the time in America where the industrialization is in full throw. So there's a lot of growth of wealth, but the wealth disparity is as big as it ever was until now. And she really is appalled by the uneven wealth distribution, the treatment of laborers, and she becomes very active in radical politics. She actually becomes an anarchist. So not, beyond radical, she's an anarchist. And she's involved in all sorts of kind of activism as well as writing. And she founds a magazine called Mother Earth, which becomes a kind of hub for radicals, free thinkers, a lot of literary folks, like Jack London. I mean, it's sort of those sorts of types are attracted to Mother Earth. And Emma Goldman is fascinating because she reads Nietzsche, and it's not a one and done kind of thing. She is reading Nietzsche repeatedly, and so much of what he writes makes its way into her politics, into her feminism, into her free love and sexuality. So it's for her, I mean, for Nietzsche, it didn't manifest that way. But for her, that was her interpretation, which is a sort of sexual liberation. And so if I were just going to touch on a couple things that I think are interesting about what Goldman does with Nietzsche. The first thing is that she, like so many radicals of her day, and I think still to our time, do what I called imitatio Nietzsche, which is a little, a little cheeky, not imitatio Jesus or Jesu, but imitatio Nietzsche, which is that Nietzsche for her became a kind of, if you will, secular saint. Here was an example of someone who sacrificed himself in the pursuit of truth, and he was fearless, and he went for it. And so for Emma Goldman, in a way, it's not slavishly derivative or anything, but she's looking to Nietzsche as an example, an exemplar of someone who sacrifices themselves, to pursue truth. And she writes a lot about Nietzsche, both the person and how this is influential for her. The other way in which it's interesting how she picks up on Nietzsche is that Nietzsche can be, one of Nietzsche's things is to be super critical of people who do not think for themselves, who take the inherited terms, the cultural conventions, the tidy religious practices, and live within that world. And Emma Goldman thought that even though Nietzsche had never been here, she thought he was describing America perfectly. She found America to be very anti-intellectual, very, the Victorian mores of people really, really buttoned up. And so she uses Nietzsche as a way to kind of critique what she saw as American anti-intellectualism, and she calls it actually American Puritanism. And so what's so interesting is we nowadays talk about like, oh, they're so puritanical or something, is, we invoke Puritanism as a way to make fun of someone who's prudish or something that seems too stifling and prissy and ultra conservative. Well, actually, it's Emma Goldman and a group of other thinkers who are essentially inventing the concept of the Puritan as the uptight, pierce-lipped, priss.
That's clever.
And they're using it basically to critique Victorianism. So she has all this amazing stuff kind of dissing American Puritanism. And it's funny because this critique is still with us today.
Yeah.
And then the last thing, which I think is so interesting about her, is that she takes from Nietzsche that any law, any code, any rule, any form of piety is ultimately man-made. And so if it is man-made, it can also be man or woman destroyed. And this is the anarchist in her. And so what you see Emma Goldman doing is taking that idea and applying it to all sorts of orthodoxies in American life at the time. And so she has not very nice things to say about capitalism. So she applies it in that way. And she is a fascinating critique of patriotism. And so she uses this sort of this anarchist idea to also break out of an idea of patriotism. And she's a critic of war. And so she uses it that way as well. But the patriotism piece, my students find this to be a fascinating argument. And even those who are the most kind of proud, red, white, and blue proud, and with good reason, read this and it takes their breath away. Because one of the things she argues in this piece is that wherever you were born is just an absolute accident of history. Like whether you're born in Lithuania, and she knew this from herself, whether you're born in Lithuania or you're born in Duluth, Minnesota, or you're born in Kathmandu, wherever you're born is essentially just an accident of history. And so she talks about the sort of provincialism and chauvinism of assuming that the place that you are born, right, and the place in which you come into relationship to the wider world is the one and only and the best. Right. And she talks about what has been, how many lives have been lost in the name of patriotism. So again, I'm not proposing that any of your listeners are going to read this and, make a flip or something and suddenly become, but it's one of the best arguments for not the absence of affiliation. That's not what she's arguing for. She's arguing for the presence of a kind of cosmopolitanism, right? That is a notion of one's identity that extends beyond, in my case, Madison, Wisconsin, or in yours, Texas, right?
Yeah.
Extends beyond the nation state, so the US, and might actually be big enough to hold together the plurality of a wider world, right? So
Yeah.
this is where you see the destructive but also regenerative parts of Nietzsche. Emma Goldman is a perfect example of that, right? So
Yeah.
she's an anarchist breaking against a notion of American, national identity or American national belonging, but she doesn't end there. It's not just a destructive impulse, it's a regenerative impulse to have a wider concept of belonging, and for her, it also meant obligation and affiliation.
Yeah. No, she's one of those people, at least for me, especially, when you study philosophy or history, or you study, we study things, we read a lot of books, and then we write and do different things with it. But every once in a while, you see an Emma Goldman who learns what we learn and then takes it and then does something to change the world. And it's so inspirational. I'm glad you got a chance to talk about her, because I think her name needs to be known a little bit more. It's just powerful, and I hope that somebody in Hollywood is just like, yes, we need to make the next summer blockbuster about her, because it's truly terrific.
I love how you put that, because I'm with you, Clara, on that too. So you're a philosopher, I'm a historian of philosophy and other primarily philosophy. And so it's fascinating to see that this is not just the contemplative life, like philosophy doesn't happen just in an armchair or a classroom, although those are very important, right?
Yeah.
I'm not dissing that. But that there's also ways in which people take that and try to instrumentalize it, sometimes try to weaponize it, some try to institutionalize it. And Goldman is an example of someone who tries to apply this philosophy to a politics of her day. And another example, it would be someone like Huey P. Newton, one of the founders of Black Power. He's a reader of Nietzsche, and you can't understand the Black Power movement of the 1960s into the 70s without understanding Huey P. Newton and Bobby Seale reading Nietzsche, among other things. I mean, this is not, they're, but in part reading Nietzsche and realizing or being confirmed that in their view, too many African Americans had misunderstood the white man's voice in their head as the voice of their inner conscience. Right. And Nietzsche helped them get that voice out of their head and learn to have their own voice. And Nietzsche's whole will to power gets reworked into Black Power. So again, this is that's one of many, but I think a super interesting way in which the philosophy and that, gets worked into a kind of an actual political program.
Right. A movement, really.
Movement. Yeah.
It's great. It's just terrific, really. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about why Nietzsche's still so popular. It's one of those things that as a philosophy professor, when I go to a bookstore, there's a pop bookstore, and go to the philosophy section, you'll see 2 rows of Nietzsche and then maybe a Kierkegaard or something like that somewhere else. So why do you think Nietzsche's still relevant today?
I think Nietzsche is, so one thing, I mentioned this, I think earlier in our conversation, but just the writing is, some people find it absolutely repellent. So, it's not a one side, not everyone feels this way, but a lot of people is that the writing is lyrical, incisive, hilarious, takes your breath away, moves you, shakes you. So one of it, I think, is truly just the power that he was just an incredibly gifted writer. And many people who read Nietzsche say they can feel his ideas. Yeah. So it's not just like his language is some sort of transparent medium for ideas. There's something so evocative that happens at the level of his language that people have a somatic experience, like a bodily experience reading him. So one is just literally the experience of reading Nietzsche, I think for many people can be very powerful. And so it's the substance of the ideas, but it's also the poetry. Right. And then regarding the substance of ideas is that Nietzsche is gives, allows readers or forces readers, depending on, I guess, your perspective, to really push up against their most sacred beliefs and their most sacred truths. And it doesn't require that you destroy them, but not have the fear to really encounter them. And so whatever your truth is, right, whatever your belief system is, Nietzsche, right, so regardless of where your politics are, or whether your religious affiliation, or whether you're an atheist or agnostic, Nietzsche helps you press up against the things that you hold to be the most true, near and dear, and really interrogate them. And there's never not a good time to do that, right? So whether it's 2023 or it's 1903 or what have you. And so I'm not saying anything specific about our moment, Carrot, right? I'm just saying something sort of like, this is why Nietzsche never goes out of fashion, because it really should never be out of fashion for us to investigate, scrutinize, interrogate our own beliefs. And then I do think in our moment, Nietzsche is particularly powerful because we're living in this sort of post-truth, no truth, alternative facts still. Everything is just a matter of perspective. And on the one hand, you could read Nietzsche and say, oh, he's the source of all this. Nietzsche's the source of all our troubles, because didn't he make these kinds of arguments in the late 19th century? And to some extent, that is true. So in other words, Nietzsche speaks to our moment because he was already anticipating it well over 100 years ago. But Nietzsche also offers a way of critiquing our moment, right? And saying that's of clapping back to there is no truth, of clapping back to alternative facts, right? Of clapping back to it's just your perspective or just your own opinion. So Nietzsche, reading Nietzsche kind of helps you critique our moment as well, because I think Nietzsche probably would have found our moment really absurd and insidious as well.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. It really does seem timeless. I mean, just going back to like pushing your own thoughts, like having those moments where you realize that you might not know everything. Those are important to all of us at any age. So yeah, you're right too. He's an excellent writer. Like you can't escape it. So we talked a little bit off the mic before about Nietzsche being a hiker. He spent time in the mountains, and I know a lot of our listeners also hike and spend a lot of time in the mountains, and sometimes we're thirsting for good things to read. And so I'm wondering if you could give us some of your own personal recommendations in terms of books that might really, be embraced by those of us who spend time in the mountains.
Yeah, so I'm so glad that you asked that. Nietzsche I don't think he's doing the kind of hiking your listeners. I've looked at your website and I've seen some pictures. I don't think Nietzsche was doing that, but he was an avid hiker, probably what you all would call walking.
Walking, yeah.
He called hiking. And his favorite places to do that were in the Swiss Alps and in northern Italy. And he often said that he only felt fully at home in the world and in his body when he was outside and when he was walking. Awesome. Part of it is that he loved the air. He wanted the air, the alpine air, which was invigorating, and he thought really clarifying for his mind. Obviously, he liked the solitude, but he also liked the movement. And so he was an ambulatory philosopher. He was someone who came up with his ideas often by walking, right? By hiking, by moving, right? And so Nietzsche's and he even writes about this. So Nietzsche, what's so interesting, I think maybe for some of your listeners, is that Nietzsche thought movement itself could be philosophical, right?
So cool.
And it's just true. So that's where he came up with some of his ideas while he was out hiking. In fact, that's the story of how he came to also thus spoke Zarathustra. what books would I recommend? This is a little bit like asking someone to choose, their favorite. So what I guess I would say is that Nietzsche comes in lots of varieties, right? There's the essay, he writes essays, which are longer, kind of a sustained argument. Thus Spoke Zarathustra reads almost like a novel. It's got characters in it. It's really a kind of a prose poem, but it's all, sort of made up figures. And then the other kind of writing that he does is aphoristic. And so an aphorism can be as short as a sentence. What doesn't kill me makes me stronger. Do you know that one? That's Nietzsche, right? Yeah. Like, boom, one sentence. Some of them are a paragraph. And part of the reason why he wrote an aphorism was because he was on the move. And so he would be walking and he would, like, an idea would seize on him, and then he would just be able to scribble just that down, right? Cool. And so he developed this form that accommodated his desire and his need to be walking. So it's just to say there's something for everybody in Nietzsche, but if I were just going to grab a few examples of things that I think certainly have really resonated with lots and lots of other readers in this long history, would be the Nietzsche. One of his early books was called Untimely Meditations, and it's a series of short essays. And one that I find particularly bracing, moving, interesting, certainly I think for you, Clara, is one called Schopenhauer as Educator. And there he's writing about the 19th century German philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer. But it's really not about Schopenhauer. You don't need to know Schopenhauer. You don't need to have read him. It's about Nietzsche's idea of what it means to learn. And Nietzsche here basically is, what he's writing is that you can't, I'm going to quote Emerson, we can only learn by way of provocation, not instruction. So what Nietzsche says is the way to be a teacher is not to instruct, but to exemplify, right? And that's because Nietzsche didn't want students to be little mimics, right, of little mini-me's of the teacher. So it's for anyone who's a teacher themselves or a student themselves, it's a really beautiful essay about learning, right? And that learning, true learning isn't mimicking someone else, but it's how that someone else can help you get on a path to be on your own path, essentially. I mean, I know as I retell it, it sounds a little cliched, but if you read it, you'll see that it's more than that. The other books that I really, really like would be, or think your readers will like, will be, and then kind of they can, any one of them will do, would be something like Daybreak. Sometimes it's translated as Dawn, Human, All Too Human, and then Beyond Good and Evil. I'll just stop right. Oh, sorry, I missed the gay science. The gay science, right. Beyond Good and Evil. So the reason, these are 4 examples of books that are mostly aphorism. And what's great about aphorism is they require a very small commitment. They require 2 minutes of your time or 3 minutes. They might end up taking 2 years of your life, but the idea is that it's not a heavy, it's philosophy that is both intense but has a lighter touch because it happens at the level of a sentence or the level of a paragraph. And you don't have to read them in order at all. He titles all of his aphorisms in these books, so you can know, oh, I want to read this one on, the British diet, or I want to read this one on, whatever, the environment. I mean, on why, something about science. So you can be as dilettantish as you want, and it's fine because they're not in an order that they have to be read in any sort of sequence. And so what those allow you, a reader, to do is just sort of follow their bliss, as it were, and then read an aphorism, and it's philosophy. This isn't just cute. These aren't just bumper stickers. It is philosophy, but so distilled. And so I think those would be those are the ones that really got me hooked on Nietzsche, if you will. But the obvious one would be Thus Spoke Zarathustra. I mean, this is the book that he's best known for, where he's trying to imagine a world after the death of God. But Zarathustra, you kind of either love it or you hate it. And I wouldn't want readers to be turned off if it doesn't grab them. Then I would encourage them to stick to or at least start with the aphorisms.
That's great advice. Yeah, Zarathustra, it kind of has that Schopenhauer's educator feel to it, right? It's great. Good call. So before we get going, I just wanted to see if you were able to give us a sneak peek into what you're researching or what you might have coming down the chute in I don't know, the next year or couple of years.
Yes, thank you. So when writing the Nietzsche book, it first started out as a dissertation, and then I turned it into a book. And I think it was about a decade. Was it a decade? It was a really long time. I aged a lot. So after I wrote the Nietzsche book, I joked that I was going to write a microhistory of a flea. Microhistory is sort of awesome. like a tiny, like how you tell a much bigger story, but through one little episode or one little thing. So I was going to do a history of a flea, because I didn't want this, big format, lots of cast of characters, 100-year-long story. But it turns out, Carrot, that must just be the way I roll, because I have backed my way again into another period, over 100-year history that I was sent on from the Nietzsche project, though it's very different from the Nietzsche project. And that is, I am working on and I have been for quite some time now, but hope to be able to talk about the book with your readers, maybe in the not too distant future, which is a history of wisdom, ideas about wisdom and the pursuit of wisdom in American life. And I was put on this, many moons ago by the Nietzsche project, because what was so striking to me and so odd was how so many people turned to him as a wisdom figure.
Yeah.
And that Nietzsche wasn't just a philosopher, he was wise. And I wondered, what did that mean to say that someone's wise, right? Or versus enlightened or really smart or brilliant? Right. What does wisdom even mean? And what's interesting is that one would think that the history of wisdom is just the sort of standard history of American education. We go to school, we go off to college, maybe but nothing could be further from the truth. So what this story is about is people who felt that the standard ways of coming into knowledge, the standard ways of learning, were distinctly unwise.
Yeah.
And so what is it that people did who sought wisdom? What forms did that take? What paths did they take? And I'm hopeful that a lot of your listeners will recognize them. I'm not saying that everybody who's a mountain climber or whatever, an outdoor adventurist is necessarily seeking wisdom. Although my hunch is some do or experience it and have it. So basically it's an intellectual history about how people broke from established authorities, established institutions, established notions of what's proper knowledge or not. And they sought something that they felt was higher, better, more precious, and could not be captured, right, by a church, by an institution. And it was something they called wisdom. So that's the history. And what I love about it is it lets all sorts of people, historical actors who otherwise haven't been well integrated into intellectual history, get in on the action. So it's African Americans who, thinkers, writers, poets, activists, who basically, called BS on various things that they were taught at school or whatever. And they use wisdom as a way to push back against white forms of authority. Women coming up with something like a women's wisdom, right? As a way of pushing back against misogyny or sexism. Native Americans, fill in the blank. It's also professional philosophers who went off to to the university to seek wisdom, and they thought that professional philosophy had chased wisdom out of the doors of the academy. And so they seek that. They want, so it's not, they're not anti-intellectual, they're deeply philosophical, but they're trying to bring back that quest for some higher form of knowledge that not just changes the way we think, but changes our whole being, and to actually bring that into our educational institutions. So a book, one of the books I'm looking at, one of many, but it's one that might be familiar to your readers or your listeners, and if not, I would recommend it, would be something like Robert Pirsig's Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance.
Right. Yeah.
He went to University of Chicago in the 60s to train to be a professional philosopher. It didn't work out. And so he took to the open road. He brought, with his motorcycle and thought about ancient Greek philosophy, Zen Buddhism, and everything in between. And I think of that's like a kind of a classic example of a wisdom, quest for wisdom that it tries to find it both in the academy, outside the academy, in the seminar room, on the open road. So that's what I'm working on now. And it's another one of those, I have so many figures involved that
I can't
it's a lot of juggling, but it's also super fun and really, really rewarding.
I kind of regret asking this question because I want to read this book immediately. It sounds so good. It's like fit for, I think, anybody who climbs rocks or even thinks about this stuff. I cannot wait. I mean, obviously you're on your own timeline with that one, but please let us know when it comes out. That sounds awesome.
Well, I might need to interview you and some of your listeners, because any one of you who self-identifies as a wisdom seeker, I need an interview with you. So
done. Yeah, absolutely. And that actually kind of leads me to I guess the final, it's not really a question, but I wanted to ask if there was anything that you wanted to promote or plug, or anything that you want to shine a light on, that you would like people to know more about or think more about. I just want to offer you a minute or whatever, to however long you want to take to do that.
Oh man. No, how about let's flip it around. Why don't you tell me something? A book after our conversation. I can't think. I'm curious what you would say to me.
So here's what I would say, maybe not to you, but here's what maybe I would say with you.
I like that.
Is just the people out there. And I'm one of those people. Early on in my education, I could care less about history. I just wasn't interested in it at all. And there's these cliches that you got to know the history, or you're going to be doomed to repeat the past. Maybe misquoted.
That's George Santayana, who also wrote about Nietzsche, by the way.
That's perfect. And so after reading your book, it gave me a new perspective on history, and I just encourage people who are studious or want to learn to take history seriously. It's not just a bunch of old dead people that you can't relate to. There's a lot of really interesting figures, some who we may never know about until we read a book like yours. So that's what I would say as a plug, is that I think you should find important things in history, even if it's maybe even the history of your own town. I think there's important things to learn that maybe somebody like me wouldn't really dig into and maybe gloss over. But I'm really happy I found your book, because it gave me a new perspective on what history means.
Oh my gosh, I'm so glad I asked you. And I couldn't have put it better myself. And I'm not just saying this in my own self-interest, because we need butts and seats at the academy,
right, exactly.
Classes, or else we're going to be packing up. But actually, you just totally stuck the landing in terms of what I would have wanted to say, and what I really what I've experienced myself. I mean, so if I just add a postscript to that, what I would say is that I didn't study history in high school. I did. I mean, whatever, we all have to, but it was that same thing, names, facts, dates, blah. And it wasn't until college that I discovered this different way of doing history, which is a way of coming into the past, relationship to the past, by way of people who were thinking about their own time and trying to make sense of their own time, and very often disgruntled with their own time. So it was this world of what's called intellectual history opened up for me, and I could keep company with them you know, like people who, Emma Goldman, you know, I'll never
Right.
meet her.
Yeah.
She died long before I was, you know, even a glimmering of in my parents' eye. But by studying history, you can come into contact with all sorts of fascinating people, many of whom are struggling with this exact same things we are in our own time. You know, I mean, maybe it was a little different, maybe, you know, obviously not everything history rhymes, it doesn't repeat, but pretty much anything we think we're struggling with in our own political moment, our own social moment, our interpersonally, environmentally, whatever, there are people in the past who wrestled with these same things. And by reaching across the expanse of time and reaching out to them, we widen our own horizon, right? It's like we're not stuck and marooned in a shallow now, you know?
Yeah.
This is our situation, this is our world, and we're just so foreshortened in our thinking. But actually, if you can go to the past and you can start to see other people, other who wrestled with the same things, you open up your community, you know, they can be part of your beloved community. They open up the range of possibility. You know, they show you maybe things that we didn't think are possible, but actually once were possible, or maybe didn't come into fruition, but we could understand why not. And so this is why I really fell in love with history as a way of, as a sense doing philosophy.
Yeah.
Was because it just opened up for me my range of interlocutors and the people I keep company with.
Brilliant.
And anything that I'm, you know, struggling with personally, politically, whatever, or enjoying. I mean, it doesn't just all have to be all storm and drang in our moment. Yeah. There's now a whole, you know, cast of characters from the past who can give me new ideas, who can give me succor, you know, and nourishment, who can remind me that this isn't the only way it has to be. So, sorry, that was a very long postscript, but you so nicely, you so nicely put what I hope to communicate to my students. I think sometimes I'm successful, not always, but and also just others that I'm sharing my material with. So I'm so thankful that you mentioned that.
Yeah, I'm thinking. Thank you for asking. It's nice to have the script flipped a little bit. Jennifer, I can't thank you enough for one, writing this book, but also for joining us today. It's been truly enlightening, and hopefully we can have you on once the wisdom book comes out.
I'd be delighted.
All right,
Thank
Jennifer,
you.
all the best.